So thank you for the invitation and hosting me here. I'm very excited to share some of our latest research on social media use during the crisis in Ukraine. Just a couple of words about us. As Matt mentioned, we're a social media lab at Ryerson University in downtown Toronto. We just opened up a new space, so hopefully if you're in Toronto, please visit us. We study how people use social media professionally as well as personally in the context of political unrests and elections. So one of the questions that we're really interested in, how can we use social media to go from a small get-together for people to something as large as a protest like we saw in Gezi Park? And so in this context, today we're going to focus on 2014 events in Ukraine, which is now called Maidan Revolution or Revolution of Dignity. The reason it's called Maidan because the main events started in the square, Maidan Square in Kiev, capital of Ukraine. But as you will see in the presentation, the events quickly spread across Ukraine and even outside of it. So I'll briefly give you background information, just some basic timeline of events that we're going to be covering. Then we talk about, we'll review quickly social media platforms that have been used during the events. And we'll focus in particular on one of the most popular platforms in Ukraine called Vkontakte or VK. And we'll present you the results of our research with this platform. All right, so one of the main catalysts of the Euromaidan revolution was really events in November 2013 when back then pro-Russian Ukrainian government essentially suspended highly anticipated trade and association agreement with European Union. As a result, a lot of Ukrainians were unhappy about it because a large population of Ukraine wanted to close the tie with Europe. And that indicated that Ukraine would move back to form closer ties with Russia. So the protest started mostly peaceful protests in the capital of Ukraine, indicated here on the map, Kyiv. But unfortunately, they turned deadly in February 2014, and over 100 people died during the clashes between the riot police and protesters. And as a result, a lot of pro-Maidan protests spread around the country, as well as anti-Maidan protests, because a significant percentage of population, especially in the eastern and southern part of the country, were for closer ties with Russia, and they wanted to indicate that they are not as happy with the changes in the country. So as a result, pictures like this were very common during that period of February, March, April, where you have protesters on both sides, pro-Maidan, those who pro-Western supporters, and pro-Russian anti-Maidan supporters would be trying to take over different government buildings and creating barricades like this. A couple other important events in the timeline that we need to keep in mind: the annexation of Crimea by Russian Federation in March 2014, followed by unrests in the eastern side of Ukraine, the part that's closer to Russia and has cultural and historical closer ties to Russia. So a number of pro-Russian separatists self-proclaimed two republics. One is called Donetsk People's Republic, and another is Lugansk People's Republic. So you can see it here on the map. And so that's primarily the area where all the military actions has been happening. In response to this self-proclaimed republic, the new Ukrainian government started anti-terrorist operation, what they call it. And so that's kind of timeline that we are covering in our research. So let's quickly look at what kind of social media platforms has been used during this time. Certainly websites are still very critical, and if you look at some of the major organizations during the time, activist groups, they would have a main website, but they quite often would link to social media profiles. So here, for example, one of the websites for Euromaidan protesters, and you can see links to Facebook, you see a link to Twitter, and you also see a link to the what we call Russian Facebook. It's a social networking website, Vkontakte, that very look like Facebook. So website important. Blogs are very critical. A lot of bloggers would share latest news with their audience. Blogs also turn to very active places for people to discuss events in Ukraine. So you often see a blog post, but you also see a lot of comments happening besides the blog posts. So kind of new places for community members to get together and discuss recent events in the country. Blogs also were critical to disprove some of the misinformation that's been spreading around the web, as well as the more traditional media channels. For example, the website stopfake.org has been trying to monitor the information about events in Ukraine, especially looking at the Russian media channels, and trying to put clear some of the misinformation that has been happening around. This is just one of the examples how one of the Russian major news channel has been reporting that over 500,000 Ukrainians sought refuge in the Russian Federation, where in fact it was only 16 people that officially applied to the immigration services of Russian Federation. And in fact, the channel, when presenting this news, they showed the footage of hundreds of Ukrainian passing the border. But what happened, that was footage actually from western side of Ukraine, the one that borders with the European Union and not Russian. So as you can see, in such an environment, what we can call information war, blogs are becoming critical tools to discuss as well as to combat some of the misinformation that's been happening around. YouTube and other video sharing websites becoming also very important. YouTube in particular, because during these conflicts, a lot of channels that would be broadcast over the air or via cable would be shut down, both on either Russian channels or Ukrainian news channels. So as a result, for people, one of the sources where people can go and watch latest news was YouTube, because a lot of Ukrainian channels would live stream their broadcast directly to YouTube, or they would publish a recent news snippets, news stories to YouTube. And there are some channels that are on YouTube only channels, where there's no official signal that would be sent to cable or over the air, but you can only get them via YouTube. So that was an important trend, especially in the situations when there's not enough information from one side or the other. The other video streaming service, such as Ustream, was very important among activists on both sides, where there's not enough coverage of events around the country. So activists would turn on their devices and live stream events directly from the protests, as you can see on this screen. I wonder though how Twitter Periscope, the new application, video streaming application, would change that, or will it be even would we see even more live streaming happening if this happens today? I suspect that we would. So it just shows the importance of that type of technology for activists groups. Instagram is not the most popular social media website in Ukraine, but during the protests, we see a lot of images being shared, again, from the sites of protests. So there are thousands of images. And it's just an excellent historical account of what actually has been happening, because each image has a date and timestamp and location associated. So you can actually go back and recreate events in a particular place and time. Twitter, we know Twitter has been very popular and important among many protesters around the world. For example, Occupy movement has been relying a lot on Twitter to disseminate up-to-date information about events in different squares. In Ukraine, Twitter was primarily used by journalists, government officials, essentially to share updates or news stories. This example of a live blog from The Guardian newspaper that was covering the events in February 2014 in Ukraine, and people have been tweeting about this story. And on your right, the network visualization shows essentially the Guardian account, Twitter account, in the middle of that star kind of configuration, and shows how people are tweeting that particular block. Shows the viral dissemination of information. Right. Wikipedia. So when we talk about information wars, I think Wikipedia is a great example of this digital ground, where you have Wikipedia editors trying to discuss whether they should change a particular section of pages about Ukraine, about movement, activist groups or not. So this example here shows you the page about Crimea, the annex area of Ukraine. And the discussion happened around early March, just when Crimea was declaring that they are joining Russian Federation. And if you read carefully the text, essentially there are different editors, and they're discussing whether they should change that Crimea should belong now to Russia in part of the Wikipedia page, or should it stay? And the discussions are around whether this is something that is recognized by international authorities or not. So Facebook is still very prominent, and we know this is #1 social networking website in the world. And Facebook is actively being used in Ukraine as well, in conjunction with all the other tools I mentioned. And so quite often you see activist groups would have their Facebook page or Facebook group set up. But alongside Facebook, we also see Russian social networking websites present. Vkontakte, I already mentioned earlier. There's another one, Odnoklassniki. It's like classmates in translation, also being actively used. Some of them more for own groups, some more for personal use, some more by news agencies. So we see a wide variety of usages. So if we summarize this social media landscape during the 2014 crisis in Ukraine, we can actually say that this is really first social media revolution in Ukraine. And the reason why I think so, because when Orange Revolution happened in 2014 in Ukraine, there was not much social media use in Ukraine. There was not much internet use in Ukraine. According to some stats, only about 12% of population had internet access. And in 2014, you remember, Facebook just was founded, YouTube wasn't even around, and same with Twitter and Instagram. So this is a great example of really truly first multi-channel social media revolution. The other important characteristic by just doing this broad review of social media usages during this time, that both sides of this conflict use social media very actively and effectively. So you have pro-Maidan, pro-Western activists using social media to broadcast their message, to organize themselves. But you also see pro-Russian groups, anti-Maidan movements are also actively using it to organize rallies, to share latest information about events, as well as government officials and other politicians. Again, because there was a lot of distrust in the traditional media, especially at the beginning of the conflicts. So it's not just activists who turned to social media, but government officials, especially the new government, they found social media, Twitter, YouTube as effective methods to deliver their speeches, to deliver their latest policy decisions. And it was interesting that a lot of news agencies will actually go to social media to pick up those news stories from those statements, from Facebook statement, from YouTube statement, and so on. Another interesting characteristic that I noticed that you have kind of duality of social media use for local use, and so in Russian language or Ukrainian language, or both, but also for Westerners, for the outside world in English. You can see that when you go to an activist group and they clearly establish one, let's say, Twitter account that would be tweeting in Russian, Ukrainian, but you have another one that's primarily in English. And I think that's a consequence of activists seeing what's been happening around the world and how social media can actually tell this story about the conflict to the whole world and how that can bring attention and potentially help to their own movement. So I think that's why they really emphasize to have that option, to broadcast to the world in English. And finally, just to summarize, so just showing you those few examples, you can get the idea that multiple social media platforms are used. It's not just Facebook revolution, it's not just Twitter revolution, it's really multiple social media platforms. Sometimes the content is duplicated. So you have a Facebook group for Euromaidan activists, you have Vkontakte group for Euromaidan activists, and sometimes you can see messages are very similar in both places. And in part, this is because there was somewhat distrust with the Russian-hosted social networking websites such as VK or Odnoklassniki. And in other cases, they just try to reach as many different audiences as possible. So, and thus creating a Facebook page versus Vkontakte group was one of the mechanisms to do so. Another potential reason is that Vkontakte quite often was used for personal use, and perhaps recognizing that not everyone would like to share their political views, especially during such a highly polarized environment with their friends and family members. So creating a new Facebook account perhaps for some could have been easier. So there are many reasons, but the fact is that it's quite clear that a lot of different platforms are used for different purposes. In our latest research, we focus on Vkontakte, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it and explain why. There are a couple references I included in slides. We recently presented a paper on this as part of the Internet Politics and Policy conference at Oxford in the fall, and also there's an upcoming journal publication with more details, more extended analysis. Some of it I'm going to present today will appear in June in Policy and Internet journal. All right, so why VK? Why should we look at the Vkontakte? Well, this is #1 social networking website in Ukraine in terms of number of users. And this map essentially represents December 2014 distribution of social media users around the world. And on this map, VK represented as this brown color area. So you can see where the social networking website is popular, primarily former Soviet Union countries. So you can see Russia, you can see Ukraine here, Belarus, and some other Eastern European countries as well. And the language is primarily Russian, but you also see groups that are just, with their national languages, such as Ukrainian. This is an example. Just want to show you a couple screenshots to give you an idea of the environment that we study in. So this is a user interface of a VK group. You can see it's very similar to Facebook group. When you log in, you have a name of the group. Sometimes it's description, sometimes group would use hashtags to define it, and that's actually highlights this multi-media, multi-channel approach where you have messages designed for VK, but actually the hashtag indicates that it would go to Twitter as well. Then you have a number of photos posted by the group and posts. Post can be a short message, can be longer. It can embed videos, can embed images. Each post will have then people commenting on it, and people can like on the post. Sometimes moderators can block commenting feature completely, and that's what we saw in some of the groups that we studied. That the comments were blocked for a number of reasons. If we scroll down the page, you can see some other sections of the group. So essentially to give you an idea that if you're a member of this group, what can you do? So there's a discussion board. This is separate from the posts that people post in the front. Discussion board moderator again creates different questions. For example, one of the posts was how to combat trolls and moderate comments. And so people would make their suggestions. Some groups would disable this feature as well because of the sheer volume of messages and inability for them to moderate some of the messages that they post. So you can also see a lot of multimedia content. You have audio, video files, photos as well, and links to relevant related groups, which is also very characteristic of this movement. Because remember, I said the movement started really in the capital of the country, Ukraine, Kiev, but it spread across Ukraine. And so different regions of Ukraine, they would set up their own groups, similar to Occupy movement, where you have, Occupy, let's say Philadelphia, Occupy Toronto. Here you have Maidan groups, so in support of Maidan, pro-Western groups, as well as anti-Maidan, that's what they call themselves, pro-Russian groups. And they may be targeted in different regions of the country. So overall, when we were trying to decide what groups to study, we wanted to study the largest groups on the topics we're interested in. We wanted to study groups on both sides, pro-Maidan as well as anti-Maidan groups. And this is just two examples of front pages for pro-Maidan groups on the left and anti-Maidan pro-Russian groups on the right. And so what we did, VK allows you to do the general search of keyword-based search of find any groups that would include a particular keyword. And we used the word Maidan in Ukrainian and Russian. It spells the same way. So we get about actually over 3,500 groups. And you can see some groups are closed, some groups are open. We only look at the open groups due to the privacy concerns. And we only look at the most popular groups in terms of number of members, because their groups range from 10 members to over 100,000 members. And so I'll tell you a little bit more about our sample in a couple slides. But first, let me tell you a particular approach we took in this research. So we are network researchers, and we wanted to know essentially what networks can tell us about a particular online group. And by networks, I mean it could be friends network, so who friends with whom in the group, but it could be other types of networks. Who talks to whom? Who mentions whom on social networking websites? There could be blogs networks. When one blog links to another blog, it's a network. There also could be kind of implicit networks, non-declared networks of like-minded individuals, when I don't necessarily say that, I'm friend with Emad, but because we like the same content, we click like button, we kind of indicate our interest and maybe indirectly connected to each other. So there are all kinds of networks exist. And so online members who participate in these groups, they leave traces. They leave traces when they interact with one another. And so we're interested in looking at traces. And the traces will tell us, or we hope it will tell us, what's actually is happening in a group. Who are the key members of the group? Is it a active group? How this moderation has happened? How the rules set up by the group influence what kind of content is being posted? Is it the group open to newcomers? And so all kinds of questions you can answer through by looking at the network structure. And so when you're doing research from network perspective, your goal is to represent data as a network. And just briefly show you so you have a graph where nodes represent people, in our case, and connections, edges, will represent some kind of relation. And a relation can be social relationships, such as who is friends with whom, or could be communication connections, who replies to whom. So you have to kind of define as a researcher, and also based on what data is available, what kind of networks you're building. So once you build the network, then you want to apply social network analysis, established method, quantitative methods, to more formally test some of the hypotheses that you observe. And for example, whether a certain group are more central than the other group, and so on. Networks are also great for visualization purposes and to develop hypotheses. As a network scholar, when I represent communication in the form of networks, or when I represent friends network visually like this, I can see immediately whether there are multiple groups involved in the conversation. Are the groups disconnected? Are they competing for something? So it doesn't necessarily answer some of my questions right away, but it at least helped me to ask questions, so create a hypothesis. And that's why we find it very powerful. And that's why we focus on network visualizations for this particular paper, to try to understand what's really happening, so that what we learn from this research, we can apply to other groups, to other networks. So we have pro-Maidan groups, we have anti-Maidan groups. Behind each group, as I said, multiple types of networks. So we focus on friends networks. So on VK, it's like Facebook. I can declare I'm friend with someone. And if both of us join the group, we would be able to know that. So we would be able to build a network that would represent who is friends with whom among all the people who are part of this group. And so the question is, well, what can we learn from this network representation? So is it useful? Is it useful without reading messages? What kind of things we can say about it? Because if we can, then we can apply the same methodology to hundreds of those groups, and so essentially to scale up our analysis. So those are our broader objectives. We wanted to establish baseline measures so that we can understand what's happening based on the network representations. We wanted to know, are there observable differences between pro-Maidan groups, so pro-Western groups, and pro-Russian groups based on their network structure, because they may be organizing themselves in a different way. We don't know that. If there are differences, how those differences in the network structures, in those network pictures I showed you, connected, or are they connected to group political ideology or some other characteristics? So those are broader questions that we try to answer in this research. For the sampling, we took two most popular public pro-Maidan groups and two most popular anti-Maidan groups. And so this table briefly shows you the number of users in each group. So you can see from 60,000 to 140,000 users, and number of connections, friends connections in each group. VK, just like Facebook, has a public API where you can collect the publicly available data to find who is connected to whom. You can also collect messages from those groups as long as they're public. As I mentioned, social network analysis was the primary method. Within that, we look at specific network measures that have proven to be useful in other network research: centrality, density, network diameter. We also use what's called exponential random graph modeling, essentially such modeling that allows you to statistically test association between certain parameters in the network. We detected different sub-communities within each network using community detection algorithms, and as I mentioned, network visualizations also were critical to study those groups. But although our big question was, what can we learn from network analysis? We also realized that by itself, we still need to go back to the content. We still need to look at group description. We still need to review some of the sample messages that people exchange. And we need to know who are the actors in the network. We had to look at the sample user profiles. And even though for these purposes we did have to do that, to establish the baseline metrics. For future research, if we have a clear tendency between network characteristics and types of users, we don't have to do that manual content analysis part, because this part, one of the most consuming parts, as many of you know. The software we use, package R, was great, handling a large-ish network like the one we had, StatNet and iGraph packages, and Tableau for additional visual analytics. And I'm happy to chat with you more details about some of the methods or tools we use. Today I'm just going to look at the overall results, but I'm happy to chat with you afterwards. So next I'm going to show you for each of the 4 groups. So remember, we have 2 pro-Maidan, pro-Western groups, and we have 2 anti-Maidan, pro-Russian groups. And so I'm going to show you networks representation of friends network for each group, and then we'll discuss what can we learn from it and what it involves to study those groups. So pro-Maidan group number 1 had over 140,000 members. It really started in early April to support Maidan, but specifically anti-terrorist operation that was part of the eastern side of Ukraine. When you look at the self-declared locations of people, majority, about 70%, were from Ukraine, but you also see some other countries involved. And for now, for this paper, we only focus on users from Ukraine and Russia, but our follow-up paper focuses on international reach, at users who reside in other countries, but still engage with this content and groups. So, as I said, we want to understand what's happening in this network. The colors help us to see some patterns. In this case, we use color to represent countries. Yellow represents users from Ukraine. Red represents users from Russia. And green, users from other countries. So you immediately see, based on network configuration, you have a large kind of cluster. Most of the users in this big part of this network in the center, and they're mostly from Ukraine. But then you have a part that kind of sticking out outside of the main group in reddish. So that suggests something different is happening. There's a smaller proportion of users, potentially mostly from Russia, and somehow they're different. So now you can start hypothesizing, right? You cannot answer that why, but at least you start forming the hypothesis. What we wanted to know, we wanted to identify, isolate all these nodes, all these users in this part of the network, and see what kind of users are they, to sample some of them. To do that, we apply what we call community detection algorithm. This is an automated approach that finds nodes that are highly connected to each other, but not connected to others in the network. And so this approach automatically, we're able to identify this particular cluster shown here in green. And so you can see there are about 6,900 nodes in this particular part of the network. And so that's what we wanted to look at. There was also another part here shown in red. It's a smaller part, about 800 people, but it's also kind of not part of the main network. So it may represent opposite point of views, alternative point of views. There's something happening there. We wanted to know why. So we sample users, top 100 users, most connected users in each of this cluster. And so it's called group 3, was identified by the algorithm, and group 42. And so we actually look at their profiles. But before we did that, we actually we knew their self-declared location, and we knew how many likes each user made in this group. So we counted average number of likes for this cluster, for that cluster, and for some other ones. This visualization shows for top 10 most largest groups in this community, in this group, number of likes, average number of likes, and this one shows an average degree centrality, meaning how friends they had. So if you just focus on group 42, for example, so this is the group 42, you can see most of the users in 42 are from Ukraine, and there are some from Russia, but the size are much smaller. The centrality, the average number of friends for people from Ukraine in this group are higher than those from Russia. If you look down in the average likes category, you can see that although the centrality of people from Ukraine higher, the number of likes people from Russia, on average, they make more likes there. So there's a shift, but but very similar, very close to each other. But if you compare the group 3, subgroup 3, and this is the first shown in this chart, the picture quite different. You can see under the average degree centrality, so average number of friends, each users from Russia and Ukraine have about same number of friends. And overall, relatively to other subgroups, it's quite high. So it's about over 15 friends on average for those groups, which is much higher than everybody else. But average number of likes are almost closer to 0 for both of the groups. So clearly, although from network perspective, structurally, those two subgroups look similar in a way because they're not part of the central cluster. But if you look at the engagement level, the 42 group is much higher engagement, average number of likes. The group number 3, almost no likes at all. And then a number of degree centralities. 42 has, I would say, about average number of friends if you compare other subgroups, but 42 jumps up. So that's kind of anomaly that you want to investigate further. And so this is where we decided, okay, we need to sample some of those users from each group to find out. And what we find out that, hey, in this green cluster, most of them are marketing and spam accounts. And in 42 group, it's an ethnic minority group in Ukraine who are Crimean Tatars. So remember, Crimea was annexed by Russia, but the Tatars actually, they were strongly pro-Ukrainian, most of them, and they wanted it for Crimea to stay as part of Ukraine because they were afraid of repressions from Russia if they do join. So as you can see, they're part of this group mostly to support Maidan movement, so they're pro-Maidan, and the reason they appear to be as a separate cluster, as a separate subgroup, is because essentially they don't tend to be friends with others in this group. So they are ethnic minority, and they visually appears that separate from the center. They support the cause, but they're not as well integrated in this particular community, geographically or for other many reasons. But on the other hand, the green color cluster, the subgroup 3, primarily spammers and marketers. And that actually explains why they have so many average number of friends. Because what happens with spammer accounts, they tend to start following each other to increase their authority. And because you can do this automatically, if you're able to set up fake accounts and start following each other and liking your content, your authority is going up. But accounts were not really interested in the actual content posted to this group. And that shows that it's almost zero. What it tells us that for any kind of social media research, we need to be aware of what kind of nodes, what kind of users we're actually studying. Are we actually studying people? Are we studying robots, bots, or marketers and spammers? And sometimes you do want to include them as part of the network, sometimes you do not. And so I think that's critical, not just for this research, but for other social media-driven research, is to be able to identify. And from my experience, unfortunately, as a community of social media researchers, we don't do enough of that pre-processing before we jump in the conclusion. There's a number of papers that look at the spam detection, fake accounts detection, but they're using that as a separate research subject. They're not necessarily connected to people studying social movements necessarily. So I hope we will see more of that is happening. So, and of course, most active, politically active users of this group would be in the center of the network, because the way network visualization works, it's trying to put most connected nodes in the middle of the network to reduce number of overlapping lines. So that visually, you kind of can guess that most connected will be somewhere here. And when you look at the distributions, their averages, you can see they're somewhere in the middle, a lot of them for this group from Ukraine, certainly. So we did this analysis for other 3 groups. I'm just going to save time and leave some time for questions, I'm just going to quickly go through the other 3 groups and just summarize what we actually found. So the second pro-Maidan group, we did the same process. We applied community detection algorithm to, again, identify those people who are not well integrated in the network, because we thought there's something interesting about them. And so this particular, it's like a comet, and it's a tail of the comet to me, and it has 2 tails. And so the subgroup 96 and 8. And so when we actually sampled comments, they both were marketers, but maybe 2 different topics or different organizations set them up. So clearly we see the pattern that if you observe from network perspective a group of nodes kind of outside, that it can be spammers, but it can be some other people like ethnic groups. So we have to be careful. We can't just remove them. And again, similar characteristic, when you look at the average number of likes, both the groups really didn't participate in this content. Although group number 8, some people did post it. All right, so moving forward, anti-Maidan group. So it's a pro-Russian group, number 1, sorry. Network configuration somewhat different. You kind of visually observe 2 clusters, but the second cluster, although it appears to be denser, it's not necessarily like an outlier. And when we examine some of the profiles, they were actually very active users. The black color cluster included mixed users, marketers, but also politically active. So there was no clear separation between marketers and politically active accounts. And this is something that we want to investigate further. Why is that? But what was clear, when you look at the location of this mixed crowd here, 64% were from Donetsk. And we know Donetsk is essentially the stronghold, is the main city for the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic. So this is the separatist movement. And so this suggested to us that location has something to do with the participation in the group. Plus the previous research suggested that that might be the case. But here you can clearly see the other cluster, subgroup 6 here, which was about even number of people from Ukraine and Russia. They were not location driven. So that kind of also suggests that as part of the group, you may have a strong group presence of locally geographically close to each other people, but you can also have people from other parts of the country, because that was a national and international event. Anti-Maidan Group 2, 69,000 members. This was a very interesting group. Even based on network visualization, you can see something different about it, right? This is the only group in our sample of 4 that shows as a one coherent group, a network. There is no outside cluster at all. We did not remove them. There are some isolated nodes, but that's a separate question. So this group actually existed since 2011. And originally it was a much smaller group and focused primarily on anti-American and pro-Russian discussions. It's only in early 2014, since the events on Maidan, that they shift their focus on anti-Maidan activism. And this is where they attracted most of their new users. But what we suspect that since 2011, they already built the core membership of very loyal kind of users who are willing to like and repost and share their content. So is that one of the reasons we think that this group appears to be very coherent? Even when we try to detect sub-communities, like we did for other groups, we couldn't. What happens is when you run community detection algorithm, by definition, it will find you communities. So you can see there are different colors, right? But you have to look at the what we call modularity index. This is the index that is also being calculated when the algorithm runs those detection process. Well, so the modularity index essentially suggested to us that detected communities don't well separate from each other. They actually overlap a lot. And so there's no clear separation between, let's say, green and gray color. Even though they are detected, there's not much difference. And visually you can see that. So this very active group, you have mostly from people from Russia, but there are some from Ukraine as well. So we are continuing analyzing that group. Why it's so different? We are looking at the moderation rules and how the group is set up, because that can influence the network formation as well. But based on the network variables that we look at, things like diameter, clustering coefficient, centralization, if you're trying to figure out whether the group is support pro-Maidan, so pro-Western, or anti-Maidan, pro-Russian, the best indicator was the percentage of users from Ukraine versus from Russia. So after doing all that fancy network analysis, we simply see that two pro-groups, pro-Maidan groups, had 69 and 73% of users from Ukraine, and anti-Maidan had certainly less. And the anti-Maidan 2 had more people from Russia than from Ukraine, period. But this is the largest groups as well. This is national, this is big groups. This may not hold, especially for international conflicts. So we want to still look in more details for these metrics, and I'll tell you what kind of patterns we observed there. But before, the main conclusion was that geography matters. The friendship ties, the participation in groups really were influenced by your location and whether your friends are part of this group. This map, essentially, this is not created by us, but it visually shows how Maidan protests spread out across country. So Kyiv is here, eastern side, Crimea. And so what we found that people tend to be friends with people from the same country. And more importantly, we found the homophily, the tendency to be friends with someone from the same city. And so we explained that it's potentially because people who attend the same protests, same rallies in the same cities, all these different dots, they are more likely than to join the group. Or it could be the vice versa. They joined the group and now they know where to go and where to protest. We don't test causality, but there's a relationship right there. And going back to those fancy measures, network measures, there is some potential possibility to look at diameter networks. So this is the essentially the distance between the longest distance between the shortest distance between A and B in the network, and it suggests how fast information spreads in the network. And so for anti-Maidan network, pro-Russian group, the diameter was the smallest and the degree centralization was the highest, suggesting that the power of the network concentrated in fewer hands. So there are more stronger individuals who holds this network together. So this is a very centralized network. And as a result, it's effective for sharing information, but it's not as what we think as democratic as possible. So essentially, degree centralization value ranges from 0 to 1. And if it's 1, it means that you have one central node and everybody connects to it. If it's 0, it means everybody is connected to everyone. So I don't depend on you to get my message across. Well, here, even though it's not 1, but it's still relatively high, as you can see, comparatively. It suggests that there are fewer accounts that are more central than others. On the other hand, Anti-2, you saw the network representation was very clustered. And so as a result, the clustering coefficient was very high. And that index, modularity index, that detects community, remember? For them, it was the lowest. It's kind of opposite to clustering coefficient. So the lower modularity index, it means the less likely you identify separate communities. The higher it is, and you saw in group Pro 1, Pro 2, it's relatively high. Again, the index is from 1 to 0. So it tells us that communities we identify, they're more likely to be different. And so I believe that these metrics would be very useful to apply to more networks to see how they perform for other pro and anti-Maidan groups. So work continues, but we certainly know that we have to watch out for spam and marketing accounts, but we also need to keep in mind that there could be supporters of the group, like ethnic groups like Crimean Tatars, who may appear to be structurally similar to spammers, but they're not. So in that case, we might need to look at the engagement level. Are these users actually posting or liking things like that? Because in that case, spammers were not that engaged. The anti-2 and anti-1 groups didn't really exhibit a lot of spammers. In one case, we saw they were quite interlinked with actual politically active users. We don't know quite why that was the reason. Sometimes moderators can block certain users. They can block the content. And in some cases, if you, a moderator, want to increase number of users just to show that you have a lot, you might disregard some of the spammers or marketers as long as they don't post content. But we need to figure out, look for more details. So just to summarize, we wanted to establish some kind of baseline measures, and certainly this is just the beginning because we only look at 4 groups, even though the largest groups in this context. We want to see how these baseline measures, the network measures that I mentioned, the engagement level, would appear in other groups and maybe other conflicts, and maybe at other platforms like Facebook. And but we do see that there are certainly structural differences between pro-Maidan groups on the left and anti-Maidan groups on the right. But it was really hard to associate those differences to actual political ideology. What we saw it more likely how each group is organized. That's would determine how this network appear. So if I'm a strong moderator, I will block a lot of spammers or ignore it. I may allow discussion board, I may block it. So I think that it's more about how each group is politically organized. Although I should mention one aspect we found interesting, because 2 anti-Maidan groups, they would clearly try to recruit militia to fight on their side. So they use that as a recruitment tool. And because of that, they were much more centralized, they're much more organized in that way. Here's a number, go call us. Get connected. So that can kind of explain why they had such a high centralization level and very dense community. So conclusions look more into the degree centralization, essentially, how democratic the network is, modularity index, how many sub-communities, are they well defined, and engagement level, certainly important to see other people engaged. And the big question, can we use SNA, social network analysis, to explain what's happening? By itself, unfortunately, we cannot. But in conjunction with other approaches, such as network visualization, community detection, as you saw, and manual content analysis, we're able to actually draw a better picture of the community, what's really happening. Why does it matter? Well, because if we look at the network structures behind each group, we can start predicting whether one group is going to be successful and one is going to fail. We can also predict how the longevity of the group, if it's going to fail, when it's going to fail. Right, so there are a lot of interesting questions we can answer by just looking at the networks, and specifically network evolution. And that's the next stage, essentially. See how the networks I show you, they change over time. Because that's the dimension that is not included at this particular work. All right, so some of the future research looking at lurkers, people who read but don't necessarily participate, look at the role of trolls and fake accounts, and investigate, as I mentioned, people outside of Ukraine but who are still active in those communities. So I think it's a lot of information. I'm going to stop now, and maybe we'll have some time for your questions. So thank you. Yes, please.
So I have two questions. The first one is, what languages were people using in these groups, and could that be responsible for the geographic findings that you had that you said were most notable?
Mm-hmm. So languages mostly Russian and Ukrainian, and Ukraine is a bilingual country essentially. Personally, so I grew up eastern side of Ukraine, and my first language is Russian, but you quickly learn Ukrainian at school. And so essentially you easily understand both languages. Sometimes it depends whether you have pro-Maidan activists trying to send message to eastern part of Ukraine, and they would be using Russian, when their normal language that they use in the forum would be Ukrainian. So it was mixed. Certainly for groups where you see a high percentage of people from Russia, you can kind of guess that it's primarily Russian-speaking group.
I guess so. Mm-hmm. You said that these groups were really polarized in terms of where the people were, and maybe that's just because if the conversation's in Ukrainian, I'm going to join that one, and if the conversation's in Russian, I'm not going to join that one. And so, I mean, I guess I'm wondering whether you don't know the degree, but what do you?
It could be. It would be a factor, but the problem with the languages also was the factor of creating of this unrest. It was. Anti-Maidan groups that didn't want to have Ukrainian as the only official language. And early on in this conflict, when pro-Russian president essentially left the country, and you had this temporary government trying to pass the law that prohibit Russian as a official language. So certainly you see a lot of unhappiness. But in the conversations, there was not a lot of tension in terms of understanding each other from both sides. So we don't know there's correlation for sure. I just don't know the causality. But thank you. That's a good point.
And then the second question is, so I don't really know the technical parts behind this, but you said you were looking at public groups or ones that hadn't restricted access to their material. And is that for both what you are able to do with the networks or just what you're able to do with the content?
Both. We only look at the public groups, and among those you can capture their public messages and their networks. Closed groups you cannot.
So, I guess I'm wondering whether the large amount of spam you're getting is because those are always, or commercial stuff is because those are of course open, and that the politically active groups are more likely to be, worried about the public face that they might be putting on, and so that you have this visualization that is, because of a selection effect, sort of very biased towards certain things you're going to find.
Yeah. That could be one assumption, but interestingly, for the groups we look at, they all were concerned with spammers and trolls. They all have discussion forums. How can we moderate better to remove spammers and maybe not fake accounts, but those actually post inappropriate content. So they certainly were concerned about it, and yes, of course, we don't see the full story. We don't know what's happening in the closed groups, but these public groups were quite open about if they want to organize a protest or if they want to recruit militia. They didn't mind that it's public. Actually, they wanted it. They wanted that exposure, and so from that perspective, you see, all the functions of a regular group, but. Would be interesting to see what are the difference between closed and open groups, and we don't have access for those, but would be interesting.
So just to clarify again, if people the group is open, but the people who are linking to the group might not show all of their friends and contacts, right?
Yeah,
so
we
don't know what right.
Yeah, we don't know their other friends and followers. API does give us a general number of friends, the total number of friends they have, certainly. And if they're account public, you can also get some additional metadata, but so those are limitations. And we know that it's a very sensitive issue, and as with any online research, we have to make sure that we follow all the ethical protocols, and so we were very careful about either not revealing usernames or just focusing on public content. Yeah, but thank you for your comments, I appreciate it.
So kind of piggybacking off of that, in addition to finding like bots and marketers, did you see any evidence, or do you think if you look deeper that you might find any evidence of like state-run accounts or users that were joining the group, opposite their position to monitor communication?
We haven't looked for those. I suspect there were few, but if they're not posting any content, they will be in that lurkers category. They read but don't post, and as a result, they were primarily undetected. We also focused primarily on nodes who have at least one friend in the network. So there are some were isolated or in smaller groups around the network, just to reduce the complexity of the task. And you saw there are quite a few things we had to do already. But those people might be the one that you're talking about. And I think that will be very interesting to see. We know for in fact, especially during active period of anti-Maidan and pro-Maidan protest rallies around the country. We know that through the traditional media reporting, how police would be following those forums to try to anticipate where the next protest is going to happen. But they were not, in many cases, they were not as successful, even when they knew that it's going to happen, just because of sheer volume of a protest sometimes. Yeah, it's a good point. Yes, thank you. Yes, please.
So I just want sort of to follow up on that. So, is the assumption that the spammers and those that you detected are only coming from specific types of groups, meaning, or is it the assumption that they can come from all sorts of sides of the spectrum? And because on Facebook, for example, anyone could buy likes, even individuals that just want to become authority or become more popular. So is it sort of the assumption that
they're types
grouped in? Yeah.
The spammers we detected in those remote subgroups were primarily trying to sell stuff, or it could be like product, services, or game-related content. Not politically, but you're absolutely right. There are quite a few posts and blog discussions how a group like that one can buy fake or spam accounts just to be perceived as they are much larger. And we don't know that information, but yeah. But the one that we detected in that community that were connected to the rest of the group were those that sell stuff.
So kind of in that same realm, did you see these groups using, and I don't know if VK is well into Facebook, but are users able to take out advertisement or boost posts spending money, and did you see any evidence of that?
If they can do what was that?
Boost the visibility of their posts by spending
sponsored posts.
Yeah, so like a boosted post or right now.
I haven't seen that feature implemented. I certainly saw how some websites would try to sell you extra spammers, but I haven't seen sponsored posts. Yeah, but there are quite a few things that moderators can do. Certainly, block or delete posts. And,
I don't know. It's very hard to know. But do you think it might be a state-sponsored type of marketer or spammers to create noise in a website? That they are now benign advertisement. I want to sell a game or something, but I some way interrupt the main discussion in the group.
Trolls were a big problem. So those isolated subgroups are not trolls because they don't really engage with the content of the group. So they are harmless in a way, right? They link you to the commercial services. That's not good, but they don't really post those. Misinformation or don't try to engage others. But there are quite a few, and it was a problem for many of these groups because we saw the discussions about it. People who join in the group to say something negative to group members and start a debate or discussion or fight even. So we don't know where in the network they are located. So they're probably somewhere in the middle, or they could be just completely isolated because they don't have any friends in this group. But that would be interesting to see, right? We know they are there, but right now this phase doesn't identify them yet. Yeah.
I just had one more question. So, sort of trying to figure out, I mean, your conclusions are obviously fascinating, and, and your interest in trying to predict which groups will be successful or not sort of reminds me of psychohistory, the science that Asimov used to describe a lot in his books about like how he can predict groups uprisings and the success that, levels that they might reach. And so I'm wondering if there are any political bodies or like external, public opinion shaping groups that were sort of interested in maybe getting some of that information, or like the algorithms or sort of showed interest in corroborating.
It's a good question. I just don't know, right? And if there are groups like that doing that, they probably don't want to advertise that they're doing that. So I don't know. Yeah. If you have some information about that, we'd love to know. Yeah.
We had a case of both using, when I'm looking at Iran, and specifically now we're talking about nuclear talks. This is a small dissident political group. They use a lot of boats to create a lot of noise. And one of the findings that we had, you look at the communication network and make sure what's the eigenvector centrality and whether they are detected, whether they are communicated or retweeted by other members of community beyond their own cluster, because they are highly tied to each other and they define a very well-defined cluster with high modularity index, but no one else in the network is communicating with them.
And so I'm glad you brought it up. Actually, this work was in part inspired by Ahmad's work on Iranian content, Twitter communication networks, because as you mentioned, you saw those opposite opinion, alternative groups or people who are against the majority, they would appear in those remote locations, right? In Twitter communication networks. And so we wondered whether people in those positions would be, let's say, those anti-Maidan supporters who don't support the pro-Maidan group, but they dare to infiltrate, like you were saying. So that was the original goal. But what happened that for Friends Network, it doesn't work that way. And there are quite a few projects done on communication networks. And certainly you can see how if it's a Twitter community, you have a hashtag here, and they all use the same hashtag, Occupy Wall Street, for example. And you have majority who are supporting this trend and this movement, and then you have a minority who are against it. And so you can visually see that those who are against it, they tend to talk to each other. But so that's why we thought it was very important work to do, because surprisingly not a lot of work done on Friends networks. In part because data is not accessible for Facebooks, for example. There are some interesting projects, but not a lot, mostly on communication side. So there is a difference between communication networks versus Friends networks. But your work did inspire us, Matt, so thank you.
I have two questions. One is any user can join multiple groups. So did you try to look into those who joined both sides of groups and what kind of people they are? And the second is, this is like a snapshot of one time. So is there any ways to look into longitudinal data? Or maybe when did these users join the group, so you can see a trend, how this group dynamic has been formed over time?
I would love to be answering those questions. So that's kind of future work. If somebody's interested in collaborating with us on the temporal models, how groups evolve actually and change, as well as the group compositions. If you belong to multiple groups, that will be interesting. We did notice, it wasn't, we didn't formally do it, but we noticed that a lot of people in anti-Maidan groups, they would be part of both groups. But I think it would be interesting to do the larger scale, sample more groups, and then see who is participating in what groups. And same with the over time. The challenge with this particular API, it doesn't tell us when somebody joined the group. We know when they first post or when they like something. So we can estimate just root estimation that when they first like it or they first posted something, that's where the membership, active membership began. But if they never posted, we don't know when they joined the group. So you would have to sample the group composition through even periods of times. And these networks together, those networks took us 2 weeks of constantly getting data. which is fine. You can do it over the year, but then of course the next fun part is to do the statistical modeling of the networks, to find the tendency of members to group geographically. Sometimes each model, the exponential random graph model that I mentioned, would took a couple days to run on a powerful server. And so there are new models. There's a Sienna package if somebody is interested in studying networks over time. So it would be interesting to apply it, but I fear that it may take even longer. So we really have to have a clear understanding how we want to approach that. But if somebody is interested in pursuing that work, we would love to collaborate. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Very nice work, by the way. I mean, in Turkey there are similar works that are being done, but with them and with this one, I have a couple of methodological questions.
Yes.
One of them is particularly the platform-based analysis what you do when you look at this, what was the name, VK network. So, for instance, the platform, if it was Facebook, which is continuously changing its timeline flow algorithms, which of course is a big interference to what your data as well, because likes and everything is changed. So this is one question. So platform-specific network analysis, I guess, has a kind of problem in that sense. And secondly, as a follow-up on this, in Turkey, for instance, during Gezi, Facebook was very, very, let's say, popularly used. But then people got very suspicious, and now I know that there's a trend to really change your user details, including your city, gender, and everything. Or another trend, using VPNs and stuff to connect to internet. So, I mean, all the data that you see is actually, especially the geographic ones, are mistaken. So I don't know what is the response to this, not only your, but as a method response. And the third one is actually, I can observe that there is a migration of especially the younger users from social media platforms to messaging apps. So I don't know how is this going to affect this body of research.
Yeah. So excellent questions. I'm glad you brought up the limitation of this type of work. It is platform specific, and it is challenging if a platform changes the interface during the study period. And sometimes we don't even know they change it if it's an algorithm that recommends posts. So that's a problem. And I raised this problem at a number of meetings like this because we as a social science researchers, we don't know what we're studying anymore. Are we studying people or are we studying algorithms, right? I was studying, and I'm not talking about bots, it's the algorithm that recommend what we see, what we do within those platforms may also change our behavior, right? So that's a major problem, and I think we need to start figuring out as a researchers what kind of we're reporting. And I think detecting spammers, that's kind of first little step, but we need to think through that. In our case, the 2014 crisis in Ukraine and using VK, we were lucky. The VK, at least visually, did not change any features. They don't have as much resources as Facebook does, and they don't have a lot of new features added over time. So if you visited VK last year, it's pretty much the same this year. So at least visually, we haven't seen those type of options. But it is something to keep in mind, for sure. And the second question was about...
It's the migration of the younger users from social media to messaging apps.
Yes.
Then it's a totally different way of a network.
Yeah, and when Emad actually visited us in Toronto at the Social Media Lab, we had a very interesting discussion, and I think you observing that in your own research, that a lot of those communication will be unseen by authorities, which is good for activists, but it also will be unseen for researchers. So I think we may have to go back to more qualitative work that's started, was used at the beginning, and maybe less rely in complement to this more quantitative data. So trying to validate, let's say, location you mentioned could be problematic, or some other user self-reported data by surveys, by interviews, and I think that's the way to go. Were you want to mention something?
Same challenge. Or the beauty of the system, you cannot
track users.
Track those users, and then we're thinking about a couple of months. I mean, even specifically in the case of Iran, I was thinking of circulating links to online surveys in these messaging app groups, but then people are not very trusting to participate. So the most effective is probably interviewing people who we can trust. And
Well, Thank you for your questions, and I know we're out of time, but I'm gonna be here. So, yes.
It was a geographical question,
Yes.
whether Ukraine and Russia were the right markers, or Western Ukraine. I'm not sure how it would affect things, but one doesn't think of Ukraine as a unity anymore in a certain sense.
So you mean when we start in groups to have a comparison between?
Everything's divided between Ukraine and Russia, and how many members are from Ukraine and how many are from Russia, but I'm not sure those are relevant.
So you're right. Let me just clarify that. When I said we only focus on users from Russia and Ukraine, it was in the context that there were users from Germany, from Canada, from the US. And so those are less than 1% of users, but I think they're an interesting case study to look at. And that's what we're going to look at in our next paper. But we focus on the largest two groups of users for those groups, which is people from Russia and Ukraine. But within users from Ukraine, you're absolutely right. It's not as unifying, and that's why we have these conflicts, pro and anti-Maidan movements. And so what we found when we look at the homophily, the tendency of users to be friends within those groups, they were around major cities. And so those cities are either Eastern Ukraine, Central, or Western Ukraine. So does it answer your question? So we don't assume.
Declared. So someone said that I am in Russia, so they were self-declared position. So it's based on user whether even they are in Donetsk, but they said that I'm in Russia or.
So certainly we acknowledge that as a limitation in the paper in terms of we need to do validation whether the self-declared location is appropriate.
It's not the limitation of your paper, I would say. It's the methods limitation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Depending on the platform, it's really, I mean, it's all about which data that you can get.
Yeah.
And if it is only the user's claimed data,
Yeah.
then it has a limitation by itself, but not papers. It wasn't really.
So thank you for the comment. But we did observe in both anti-Maidan and pro-Maidan groups, based on the self-declared location, people, both of the types of groups had people from Western and Eastern and Central and South part of Ukraine. Most of it from Kiev, but people from Kiev could be anti-Maidan and could be pro-Maidan as well. So it's much more complex picture than we thought. We expected there was a much more people from Western Ukraine and pro-Maidan groups. We expected more people from Western, and in anti-Maidan, pro-Russian would be here. We didn't see that as much, unless they focus specifically on Donetsk, the Donetsk People's Republic. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much.